Hey, I'm Chase, and this is All Things Random. Today, we're talking about what I consider the best vintage Homage GMT on the market. Now, I love vintage watches. I love the cream-colored indices that have faded away over time, the dial layout, the case shape, and the scratches and damage on the outside of the case that shows a lifetime of wear before it ever came to you. Now, as much as I love the idea of vintage watches, there are a lot of downfalls when it comes to vintage watches themselves. One, if they are old and the movements are discontinued, they are extremely difficult to service. In fact, they can be so difficult to service that if a part breaks, it has to be custom built, which means now it's going to cost you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to repair a vintage watch. Because of that, some micro-brand companies have released vintage homage style watches or vintage style watches that resemble vintage watches that currently exist or did exist. As much as I love vintage watches, it makes sense why people would want to buy something that is vintage inspired, because the cost, the rarity, and sometimes the overall pain of vintage watches just are not for everybody. So I did some searching, and I love eBay, I love Amazon, and on eBay I found, now it did come straight from China, I did find a vintage inspired GMT that looks sort of like the 1960s Rolex GMT Pepsis for 70 bucks. Now, it is an automatic GMT, and I know for $70 how good of quality is the movement inside. Well, I can tell you that instead of spending $600 to repair it, it may be easier just to throw it away, and that may be more appealing for some people. Now, again, I bought this on eBay straight from China for $70. Now, let's flip the camera around and see if it's any good. And this right here is the watch I'm talking about when it comes to the vintage GMT for $70 that I found on eBay. Let's talk about it a little. The case is 13L stainless steel, and it does have a case diameter of 40 millimeters. The case aesthetic is just like the vintage watches, to include the lugs, which are all drilled through. That gives it that classic 1960s, 70s, 80s Submariner GMTs where they actually drilled the lugs through. The case is a high polished case, has nice crown guards. It does have a screw down crown. We'll talk about the movement in just a second. And again, the other side is high polished. The back is a sterile back with a brushed steel case back, and it does have hollow end links. Now, a lot of people would say that's a little strange to have hollow end links. However, a lot of vintage watches, to include the Rolexes, had hollow end links. So if this is going to be a vintage aesthetic, a vintage homage style watch, it would be reasonable to think they would also have hollow end links. Now, the dial, let's talk about the dial real quick before we talk about the bracelet. I love the dial in this. It is a matte black with applied indices. The indices have a really nice faux patina that give each one a pretty nice uniformed cream color. The hands are classic Mercedes with the same matching style patina as the indices themselves. And it does have a really nice red GMT hand with the triangle lume being the same as the rest. I really like the look of the font that they chose for the 3, the 6, and the 9. And this does not have a date window. However, the movement does have a date wheel beneath the dial. We'll go over that in just a second. Now, the bracelet itself. The bracelet is a 3-link bracelet. It has high polished middle links and brushed links on the outside. The clasp is more of a newer style clasp. It does have a nice little pull there. It is nicely machined. It's not cheap feeling at all. The only thing I don't like about it is wearing a glide lock clasp on my Rolex Submariner. It's micro adjustable, so you get used to using the micro adjustments on the case itself. This only has screw links, which are great. I'm glad it has screw in links as opposed to push pin links, so it is a little more higher quality because it has the screw in. However, it doesn't have any micro adjustment except on the inside of the clasp right here. It does have slight micro adjustments right here. It does have a diver's clasp. However, I don't understand why it does, because this only has 30 meters water resistance. However, it does have some micro adjustments right there, and it's just enough playing around with it that it fits on my wrist nicely right now. However, if it swells up or it gets really warm outside, I'm gonna have to adjust the lengths. Really, my only thing that I don't like about this watch is the fact that it doesn't have micro adjustments. However, I can't expect everything to have a glide lock clasp like Rolex. It's just once you wear it, it's really hard to go back to bracelet watches that don't have it. The bezel on this is aluminum. It does have the blue and red, which is considered the Pepsi bezel, and it is bidirectional, so it rotates both ways. Because it is a GMT, it offers 3 time zones. The standard time zone, this hour hand is a second time zone, and then you can move this into a third time zone. If you want to learn how to do GMT watches, set different time zones, just leave a comment down below and maybe I'll make a video on it. Now, last but not least, we're going to talk about the crystal on this watch. I'm going to turn this to the side and you'll see this very large, very pronounced domed acrylic crystal. Now, I myself am not a huge fan of acrylic crystals. However, this is true to the vintage aesthetic of the watch itself. Vintage watches all had acrylic crystals, all had domed acrylic crystals, some had flat acrylic crystals, but this right here, I think this is beautiful. This really gives the watch a nice, elegant design. It gives it something kind of unique. And you know what? You can always just simply use a little bit of poly watch if it scratches. However, overall, I love this watch for $70. If this thing lasts me a few years, I have zero complaints. A little bit of poly watch, a little bit of wear on it. This aluminum bezel is going to wear quite nicely, I think, whereas it'll age quite nicely. Like, it'll start scratching, unlike the ceramic ones. It'll give it some unique look to your watch itself. This is a new vintage style watch as opposed to a vintage watch already. Now, the movement inside. I couldn't find hardly any information when it came to the movement inside. Now, some people said it was a SeaGull GMT movement. That was a replica of the ETA, I think, 2836. However, I found nothing to confirm that. It simply says automatic GMT. When I unscrew the crown, it does have a really nice winding action to it. When I pull it out to the first position, right here, if I turn it forward, I can actually feel the date adjusting. And if I turn it backward, the GMT works. And again, pull it out, and it works just like it should through the GMT. All in all, I think this is a great watch. Now, let's take a look at it on the wrist. Here's how it looks on my 7.5-inch wrist. 40 millimeters is a perfect size for this watch. Again, this is the closest fit I could get without using any type of specialty link. This is just a half link plus a micro adjustment on the buckle. It wears a little tight right now because it is warm in my house. Once I walk outside in the cold, the -2, then it loosens up a little bit. However, when summertime comes, I'm gonna have to change one of the links to a full link and maybe micro adjust it one more time. Other than that, that is my only complaint for this watch, that and the lume. Now, once you charge the lume, it is pretty bright. However, it fades pretty quickly. I would say that the best I've ever gotten it so far since I've had it for a week has been about 5 minutes before it fades into almost nothing. Now, I listed the pros and cons, and I'll be honest with you, $70 for this vintage watch, as long as it holds up for a year, 2 years, 5 years, I think it's a great deal. I think it's basically the best deal on the market for an automatic GMT. Now, if you find these interesting, I'll try to find a link and leave it down in the description below. You can check it out yourself. Now, if you like videos like this, hit that subscribe button down below and leave a comment of the content you would like to see next. Now, next week, I'm spending a lot of time in the pool. I'll be testing out a Smapco Mini 0.5 liter scuba tank, and I'll also be testing out some waterproof wireless earbuds to see just how waterproof they truly are. Now, the next watch video that's going to be released, I will be turning a pilot's watch that I cased myself into a Panerai Homage, because who's got $6,000 for a Panerai? But the parts used for this to move one movement into another movement was like $60, and I may have a Panerai Homage watch. So hit that notification bell so that you can be notified when I release those videos. Until next time.